It's time for Herd Mentality, the weekly episode where you control the discussion today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of the Herd Mentality Substack, co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast, co-host of the NFL First Read Podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. Well, folks, welcome in. Herd Mentality is the topic today. And, of course, that means you are in control of what we discuss. Have lots of things to get into. Let's get started. First one comes from Josh, who says, we have a nice little group of guys who contribute/start for us up for extensions. James Cook, Terrell Bernard, Christian Benford, Greg Rousseau, Khalil Shakir, and Damar Hamlin. Going with the assumption the organization decided to keep them all, can you give us projected contracts for each? It's a good question, and let me say one thing about this before I give you some numbers. You're exactly right that all of those players are extension eligible. However, only one of them is actually an expiring contract. That's Damar Hamlin. All those other players, Cook, Bernard, Rousseau, Shakir, Benford, they're signed through 2025. And so the Bills don't have to figure out extensions for all of these guys this offseason. I'm sure they will for some, but the urgency may be different for other players, and you don't have to get it all figured out right now. So let's just keep that in mind as we start to navigate this offseason, that they're extension eligible, but their contracts are not expired. They expire after the 2025 season. And for all of these players, I do plan on taking a very deep dive into all of them. And so that will obviously impact where I personally land on these projections and what I think the team should do. But for the sake of providing an answer to this question, I went to spotrac.com, which does a terrific job of projecting salaries. And this is where they have each of those players at in terms of average annual value. For James Cook, they have him at $10.2 million. And I think there's going to be a very interesting conversation to have about what the appropriate amount for James Cook is. Obviously, a really good player for the Bills, productive, versatile skill set, but measuring what he should get compared to the Derrick Henrys, the Saquon Barkleys, it's very different. Barkley is like an 80% of the snaps guy. James Cook's a 45% of the snaps guy. That's not the third down back. That's not the closer for the team. And so while I have certainly warmed up to the idea of paying James Cook, there's some variables that matter. And that's why I think SpotRack is very correct to be in this 10.2 million range and not like 15. Because I think that's the difference between, okay, you're a legitimate 75% of the snaps back versus 45%. And there's some pieces of the role that as a lead player, he doesn't provide. And so I think that all has to be factored into what's a fair contract for both sides. I'm very curious to see how that plays out. For Terrell Bernard, they have it at $6.7 million, which is interesting. That's more along the lines of where those Bengals linebackers fell, Logan Wilson, Jermaine Pratt, compared to, where you're seeing like a Frankie Louvu type player. I'd guess it's a lot higher than $6.7 million. For Greg Rousseau, they have him at $24.9 million. Obviously, that's a lot. One of the great incentives of Rousseau being the player or a player that the Bills get done this offseason, if that's what they choose to do, is he's playing on the 5th-year option. So his cap hit for 2025 is, I think, a little over $13 million for the year. That's a firm number. There's nothing you can do about it other than extend him, and then you could take that opportunity to reduce that dollar amount, create cap space, and then, of course, spread that money across the duration of the contract. And obviously his cap hits will go up, but you could get some relief this year. I think that's what's unique about Rousseau and the idea of extending him this offseason. For Khalil Shakir, Spot Rack has him at $19.4 million per season. For Damar Hamlin, they have him at $3.1 million. And for Christian Benford, $23 million APY. Benford's he's a freaking stud. He's going to get paid a lot of money, and I think he deserves it. So that's where Spot Rack has those projections, and obviously I'll flesh that out with some deeper conversations as we move further into the offseason. Dan says, I was wondering if you had any data on Khalil Shakir's versatility, both his frequency and effectiveness outside versus the slot. Is my impression correct that he is mostly a slot-only player? And if that's the case, how does that impact his market value? I feel like slot-only players are relatively easy to find, and that lack of versatility has a high opportunity cost in heavy personnel offenses, whether that's passing on Ladd McConkey or giving fewer snaps to Coleman, Kincaid, or Samuel in the slot. I love Shakir, but I wonder if his production is easier to replace versus other extension-eligible players if we had to make any difficult decisions. Thanks, and go Bills. So Khalil Shakir this past season played, and really the last 2 years, is right at about 75% in the slot and 25% out wide. The Fantasy Points data suite, which is by far the best data resource in the football world, they have Khalil Shakir charted to have run 88 routes from a wide alignment and 256 routes from the slot. On those 88 routes, they chart him with a 3.4% win rate when running routes from the outside. When running those 256 routes from the slot, his win rate goes to 9.4%. So 3 times, basically, the win rate success running routes from the inside versus wide alignments. And so, yes, I do think Khalil Shakir is most effective in the slot. I don't know that he's exclusively slot only. Probably a 75-25 split is what makes sense. But one thing that I will say is let's be careful about saying that it's very easy to find slot-only type players. There's a chemistry element with the quarterback that really matters. I remember watching the Patriots for all those years with Wes Welker and Julian Edelman and thinking to myself, not only why doesn't every team in the league have this player, but also what if the Patriots had a player in that role that actually had some athleticism that you really didn't get from Welker and Edelman. Those are great players, but they're not the players that they are because they're super dynamic. And the reality is there's more to it than just, hey, anybody can go win from the slot, or, hey, what if you got a slot player that actually had some legit quickness and breakaway speed and all that type of stuff. So I've learned some lessons along the way that there is something to that role, even though it does appear to be easier. And look, it's playing in the slot is a lot different than playing outside. You get a two-way go with your releases from the slot, where out wide you're playing heavyweight fights every single snap, where you have to beat potentially coverage that's right in your face, and you have to be able to beat press, and you have to deal with that physicality to get into your route stem. It's a different ball game. So I think you can look at the slot and say, yeah, it's probably easier to play it, but I think you can get yourself in trouble by assuming that it's, you can just slot anyone in there. I mean, Isaiah McKenzie certainly didn't make anyone forget about Cole Beasley when he got his opportunity to be in the slot, and I think that's probably a great way to sum up this conversation. All right, plenty more to get to here on the other side of it. We're going to talk quarterback depth, Tyler Bass, defensive line development, and more. Folks, be sure to stick with me. The big game is almost here, and there's no better way to make it even more exciting than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings awarded, PrizePicks makes it fun and simple to get in on the action. Here's how it works. You pick more or less on at least 2 players' projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. PrizePicks has a free pick actually available for the big game where Patrick Mahomes only needs to throw for 1 yard to win. You pair that with one more correct pick, and you are cashing out. This week, I'm going to pair that Patrick Mahomes 1 yard with selecting more on Travis Kelce's receiving yards, and I think I'm going to do all right with that. And what I love most about PrizePicks is the fast, safe, and secure withdrawals. When I win, my cash is in my account in as little as 15 minutes. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. All right, folks, the next one today comes from Lindsay. Lindsay says, it appears to me that Bean has a Josh or bust mentality with backup quarterbacks. I can't imagine a world where we survive a 4 to 6 game stretch if our big special boy is injured. Trubisky/White don't seem like viable options if we're in the hunt and need some quality starts. Yeah, Lindsay, I'm with you. I think that they do have that mindset. And it's concerning, right? Like, you don't want to live in this world where Trubisky or Case Keenum or Mike White or Matt Barkley or whoever they've had as the quarterback depth actually has to play. And thank God Josh Allen's been the most durable quarterback in the NFL. I think this is what it comes down to. The Bills roster has become pretty expensive. They got a lot of expensive players. And in this salary cap world, you have to make concessions. And I think the Bills assess their situation and say, you know what? While you'd love to have a really, really good backup quarterback, can't really pay it. And you have to make concessions somewhere in terms of where you're going to invest money. And with what you're paying Josh, what you need to pay the rest of your roster, I think the Bills look at quarterback depth and say, you know what? We don't want to have a lot of money tied up there. And so far that's worked because Josh Allen has been so durable. So I do think it's an area of the roster where they do make a concession and don't want to have a bunch of money tied up. But also I think the Bills value the makeup of the room and how it works together to support Josh Allen more than if someone actually had to go in and play. And when you think about it, that's more of what their job description is. You know, how do you support the starter? How do you be an asset to Josh Allen throughout the week? How do you be an asset to the team in terms of scout team? How do you be an asset to Josh Allen on the sideline during games? I think that's what they care most about. And so those relationships that Josh has with a Trubisky or a Keenum or a Barkley or whatever guy it's been, it looks like he's got something going with Mike White and Shane Buechele as guys he has good relationships with. They value that more than, you know, the regrettable idea that Josh Allen would have to miss time and someone would have to step in. So I don't think you're wrong. I share in those concerns, but I think that is my best ideas to explaining the Bills' approach there. Chris says, now that the season is over, can you give us an idea of how Tyler Bass finished, stats and metrics wise, when compared to the rest of the league? I feel he certainly has his rough moments, but I also feel like he finished the season strong. And this season also sort of became the season where normal kickers suddenly couldn't make field goals anymore, like Justin Tucker and Jake Elliott and Younghoe Koo and Evan McPherson. So I really don't have a clue where Bass finished compared to the rest of the league. Can you shed some light on this for me and the fans? So among the top 32 kickers in the NFL in field goal attempts, including the postseason, Tyler Bass finished 16th at 85.7% made field goals overall. He was 30 for 35. He was 24th in extra point percentage at 93%. 6 of 6 from beyond 50. I think there's only four or five total kickers that were perfect from beyond 50. Obviously had the massive kick against Miami, the 61-yarder to win it, franchise record. And I think this is where I land on Tyler Bass. I mean, the result of the season, exactly what happened for the Bills this year, was in no way negatively impacted because of Tyler Bass. And that's a good place to be. And in fact, you could look at some moments where, yeah, he absolutely was part of your recipe for winning a game. And so I thought they did a good job of not panicking. And boy, it got loud. Way that even myself, the concerns that I had about Tyler Bass, my concerns about Tyler Bass were very obvious, but I also was not eager to cut him and eat all the dead cap. I think $7 or $8 million in dead cap to move on from Tyler Bass. So I think the Bills managed that very well. And you highlighted several kickers that just had down years. And here's a list of kickers that Tyler Bass had a higher field goal made percentage than. Brandon Aubrey with Dallas, everyone's darling of a kicker. He had a higher made percentage than him. Daniel Carlson with the Raiders, Jake Elliott with the Eagles, Justin Tucker, Younghoe Koo, Evan McPherson, Kaimi Fairbairn. Tyler Bass had a better season than all those guys. So thought the Bills managed that very, very effectively, despite a lot of noise. And look, they brought in some competition along the way, and maybe that helped, but it's nice to not have to talk a lot about kickers this offseason. We'll see what happens on the punting side, though. Scott says, I have a Myles Garrett question and was hoping you could discuss this on a future herd mentality. You mentioned he is 29 years old, been in the league 8 seasons. I mentioned he could command a 4-year, $140 million extension from any team potentially trading for him. If that came to fruition, he would be under contract through age 35, 2 years left on the current deal. How does his skill set and injury history project moving forward? Von Miller is 35 now, and it feels like we are doubling down on a bad bet chasing after a player with a $35 million AAV when the $20 million player didn't pan out like we had hoped. So I don't know if it's going to be exactly 4 years added to the current deal or anything like that. I think you're probably paying him until around that 33 to 35-year-old range. And there's obviously a calculated risk with this idea, right? That's how it goes. You hand big money to any player in the NFL, there's obviously a risk that it doesn't work. And whether that's regression or injuries, yeah, it's a possibility for sure. And the Bills have been on the wrong side of a good bit of that. Von Miller, Tre'Davious White. It's unfortunate. And I would say for the Von Miller deal, he was on track. He tore his ACL. I mean, for all the commentary that it's a flop signing, and it is because ultimately you don't look at what he gave the Bills in totality and say it was worth the money, but certainly looked like it was going to be. He tore his ACL, and when you tear your ACL in your mid-30s, that's going to be tough. And so I think that's an unfortunate piece of it. Where I would be encouraged about how Myles Garrett ages is that there's a lot more power elements to his game. He's not really a guy that relies on burst and bend. He's a guy that can win with power and physical traits in different ways. And I think that probably ages better. You know, a guy like Von Miller, his whole game is burst and bend. That's what's going to make him a Hall of Famer. Well, when those things go, that's a problem. But I think you can look at some older pass rushers that were effective into their mid-30s, and you could see how the body types and style of rusher is more aligning with Myles Garrett, guy like Michael Strahan, guy like Bruce Smith, guy like Julius Peppers. After age 30 and beyond, Michael Strahan, 22 and a half sacks, 11, 18 and a half, got injured, had 4, came back, had 11 and a half. Bruce Smith was unbelievable into his 30s. 6 10-plus sack seasons in a row, starting with age 30 and 6 of 7. He went 14 sacks, age 30, then 10, 10 and a half, 13 and a half, 14, and 10. Julius Peppers, age 30, 8 sacks, and then 11, 11 and a half, 7 and 7. I think Myles Garrett ages more like those players than a Von Miller type based on stylistic differences, body type differences. So yeah, there's no doubt. Like, I acknowledge the risk factor. I certainly do. But it certainly feels like a really unique opportunity to get a player like this. I'm on record as saying Myles Garrett's the best defensive player in the NFL. And it's not a swing that I take great exception with. I really don't. I mean, I don't know what the package would be, but let's say it's 2 first-round picks. Let's say it's this year's one and next year's one. Well, you had to pick somebody with this year's one anyway, so your net is just next year's one. You're not going to have some pick that's probably going to be late in the 20s, early 30s, hopefully. I just can't find myself not willing to swing the bat. And look, it doesn't have to be Myles Garrett. I'd love to have Trey Hendrickson. I'd love to have Max Crosby. Just give me some type of dude here for this defensive line that can provide the impact in clutch moments when this team needs it, where it's been lacking. All right, we got more to talk about on the other side of it, including defensive line development, another Myles Garrett question, and if the Bills should draft a quarterback, that's kind of fun to consider as well. Folks, be sure to stick with me. This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now, Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today, an expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy. Also, you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, this is Taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. All right, folks, the next one today comes from EPEA. Is it time to start questioning Sean McDermott's ability to develop defensive linemen? I feel like we have plenty of examples of players underperforming, especially considering the high amount of draft capital we've thrown at the position. Free agent signings don't appear to be any better, and worse off, you have examples of them going elsewhere and at least being serviceable, like Poona Ford and Tim Settle. What needs to change to get better development with those players? I can understand asking the question, but I think more than a development issue, I think they've had talent issues. I think we've expected a lot of average players to be better than they are. And I think we are expecting an average collection of players to make more of an impact than they're capable of. And so that I think it's more of a scouting question. I think they have to figure out their process for picking defensive linemen that they bring into the building. I think that's probably more important than anything that is or is not happening with player development. And where I think you can find some satisfaction in what has happened with the Bills defensive line is you've seen very established outside players like a Leonard Floyd, like a Von Miller before he got injured, come in and maintain who they were at that point in their career. Obviously, you can look at Carolina, and Sean McDermott as a defensive coordinator had guys like Kawan Short, Charles Johnson, Mario Addison, Greg Hardy that were really good players and were really good players for a number of seasons. And so certainly there's been some missteps along the way. Boogie Basham. I mean, A.J. Epinesa, I think he's been fine as a spot starter, rotational player, but obviously he has his limitations. I think Greg Rousseau has been an absolute hit as a end of the first round type player, and the developmental curve that was necessary there. I think he's been excellent. Ed Oliver certainly had his moments. Is there something from a coaching perspective that's limiting Ed Oliver? I don't know if I would look at that, but I think it's a fair question, but there's enough on the other side of it where I just don't know that it's really as much of a coaching thing as it is. You just need to get better players. that have more capacity to be more impactful. I think that's what it comes down to more than anything. Michael says Josh Allen is my favorite Bills player of all time. I hope that we have him as our quarterback until he retires as a Bill. That being said, is there any sense that he may have undue influence within the Bills management that may lead to team choices that wouldn't be made if he wasn't there? Maybe the choices aren't the right ones. Specifically, it was clear that Josh felt that Keon was the receiver he wanted. He mentioned Keon in an interview before the draft as one of the receivers that he liked, and it was stated that after the draft that Josh wanted Keon. Was Josh brought into the process to provide input when the team was already high on Keon, or did his preferences significantly influence the Bills' pick? The book isn't written on Keon, but would another receiver have fit better into our offense? Also, how does his preference impact the makeup of our backup quarterback room? Well, I think Josh Allen does have influence, and I think he should have some influence. And I also, you've heard both Josh Allen and Brandon Beane acknowledge that Beane has the final say. I think the cherry on top is that if where Beane is thinking is aligned with what Josh is thinking, and it works out, and maybe that's exactly what happened with Keon Coleman. I mean, obviously, you could look at the other receivers that were drafted, and whether that's Ladd McConkey or, sure, Xavier Worthy, whatever, and feel like those guys are on a better path, had better rookie seasons. Obviously, Keon Coleman's injury affects that. But I don't know. I mean, I evaluated the wide receiver class, and I'm not surprised that McConkey and Worthy had better years than Keon Coleman. I thought those were better prospects. So that's why the messaging that I've always had on the Coleman deal, and I think people, if you've heard my commentary on Keon Coleman since before the draft, you know exactly where I stand on him. And I think in many ways he was exactly the player I expected him to be. But the point that I've always made with Keon Coleman is that you knew what you were drafting. It's on you to make it work. Like, you knew the skill set, you knew what it was and what it wasn't. You knew the investment. Like, now it's got to work. It's on you. And so I'm interested to see how it plays out. But yeah, I don't think anyone in the world could honestly look at the situation and say, yeah, this team's better because they have Keon Coleman and not Ladd McConkey. But that's where it landed. So Josh does have influence. Beane does have the final say. I do think that this does bleed into the depth at quarterback situation, but also you have to be mindful of what I talked about earlier in this episode about, hey, you got to make some concessions. And does it make sense to actually have meaningful dollars tied up in your backup quarterback? I can understand the thought process there. Which leads into a second follow-up question from Michael, who said, should we be looking to draft a quarterback? If so, should we be thinking of this soon? During the Tom Brady era, the Patriots drafted 10 quarterbacks. They used 1 second-round pick, 3 third-round picks, 2 fourth-round picks, 1 sixth-round pick, and 3 seventh-round picks. If the Patriots and Brady were comfortable spending draft resources on backup quarterbacks, maybe we should be as well. Here's what I'll say about that. Look, pointing to the Patriots' blueprint as a replicable form of success without Brady and Belichick has proven time and time again to not work. Those were unique circumstances in New England, and you've seen front office people and coaches pluck from that Patriots team, and they try to replicate it somewhere else, and there's not a lick. I mean not a lick of success to show for it. You have failed hires all over the league because teams wanted to replicate the Patriots. It doesn't work without Brady and Belichick. And I think obviously with drafting a quarterback, there becomes a roster ability conversation. Are you really going to be one snap away from a rookie quarterback? I guess, to me, I'd rather be one snap away from Mitchell Trubisky. I would, than some 4th-round pick or 5th-round pick. And I'll tell you what, I don't feel super strong about this. I think that the Bills are more likely to get a Christian Benford or a Khalil Shakir or a Matt Milano with a mid to late round pick than a quarterback investment that would actually help the team in a meaningful way. So again, I don't feel strongly about this. I don't believe in pointing to the Patriots blueprint as something that any team should try to replicate because it's proven time again to not be successful. And I think the Bills should use their draft picks on players that can actually help them win, as opposed to, throwing darts at backup quarterbacks that you'd be one snap away from because you have to roster them. And obviously, your picks are not investing those draft picks in position players doesn't mean you're going to get a Benford or a Shakir or a Milano. Obviously, that's not. I mean, they could obviously be, insert whatever not very good player, that you wind up drafting. But I think you got a better chance of getting a meaningful position player than a meaningful backup quarterback when you have Josh Allen. James says, you mentioned a no trade clause. Does Myles Garrett have a say in where he can be traded? If he wants to win a Super Bowl, can he decline being traded to a subpar team? So I've mentioned the no trade clause because I heard it mentioned before in things that I read and listened to. This has been questioned whether or not Myles Garrett has a no trade clause or not. And obviously, I'd like to have clarity on that before I continue to be mindful of a no trade clause, because I do think it is significant, because then it's not about a bidding war. It's about who Myles Garrett's willing to waive the no trade clause for. So we need to stay tuned on that to get some clarity. James had a follow-up question that says, can you quantify what has worse effects for a team, onboarding a poor free agent or drafting poor high picks? I think it's the free agent. There's the money element. Of course, there's always opportunity costs, and if you invest a high pick on a player that doesn't work out, you miss on a chance to get a impactful player on a rookie deal. I think that matters a ton, but when you start to throw big dollars at a free agent and they flop, I think the opportunity cost of what those dollars could have went towards, whether that's extensions for your own players, whether it's different players, I think that's a bigger deal than missing out on draft picks. Obviously, you like them all to hit, but those hit rates are not very good all the time, whether it's free agency or the draft. So we're here. It's team building season, right? So these are the types of questions we'll be diving into, and obviously a lot for Brandon Beane and company to think about as they try to craft this roster in 2025. All right, folks, thanks for stopping by today. Really appreciate it. Lots of good content coming the rest of the week. We'll get into some more review stuff. I want to talk quarterbacks, of course. We'll get into some Josh Allen and really assess the season that he had, and a whole lot more the rest of the week. So don't miss anything. Make sure that you are subscribed. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills, and I look forward to catching up with you again real soon.